What are 5 common practice mistakes that might be slowing down your progress? One of the number one problems I see is not practicing in small enough sections. So learning a piece is somewhat analogous to studying for a test in school, and I like to divide the music into small little bits. It's just like studying using flashcards. And the whole point of a flashcard is to separate the information into these bite-sized pieces, thereby making it easier for you to digest and to remember, because it's a lot easier to remember just a flashcard of information than try to think of memorizing an entire paragraph or a chapter of a book. So if what you do when you practice is just start at the beginning and play until you can't play anymore, that's not really practicing, that's reading through the music. And not that there's anything wrong with it, but if what you're looking for is to play a piece better and make efficient use of your time, that's probably not the way to do it. The more you struggle with a passage, the more you need to isolate that and go over it and break it into smaller and smaller bits. A lot of times people don't realize when I say small little pieces, it means a really small piece. And depending on the context, that could mean 3 or 4 measures. It could mean 2 measures. It could even mean half a measure at a time, or just focusing on the transition from one chord to another chord. For instance, what will happen a lot of times is a student will start a piece, they'll play through and continuously mess up on the 3rd chord of measure 4. Then they'll go back to the beginning, they'll play again, they'll mess up at the 3rd chord of measure 4. They'll go back to the beginning. And what that is it's really wasted time because they didn't mess up anywhere at the beginning. They only messed up at that particular chord. So isolate that section. Just practicing that will save you a lot of time. Now, the second mistake is taking a technical or a musical idea that you learn in one place and applying it in the wrong places. So suppose you learn how to get this technical scale passage down in a Mozart piece, and you learn to kind of tuck in your fingers, use smaller finger movements, maybe the knuckles, maybe the rotation in the Alberti bass, maybe voicing in a particular way. And then now you're faced with the Chopin Nocturne and a lyrical section. These techniques will be vastly different. So I strive to develop a technical approach that is just as varied as the musical ideas are. Because without a technique that matches the musical idea, that idea is not heard by anybody else. Now, the third common practice mistake is what I like to call mindless repetitions. I used to hear this all the time, especially when I was a student, just hanging out in the practice rooms. You'll hear someone play a passage, they'll mess up the first time, they'll play it again, they'll play it right. The 3rd time they'll mess it up, 4th time is right, 5th time is right, 6th time they'll mess it up. So it's just continuously doing the same thing over and over and still not really gaining mastery over that section. And so it begins to feel more like a gamble than actually practicing. Like, is it going to be right this time or is it going to be wrong this time? A lot of times the origin of this is just practicing too much the same way and not really varying the practice style and the methods and taking apart the music layer by layer to understand what's happening and causing the problem. So usually that starts with simply not playing it slow enough. But even more than just slow practice, what will help is to practice in a variety of speeds. Sometimes you need to pause on chords or pause on this unique harmonic moment rather than just, playing through. But try to avoid the habit of just playing something over and over, not changing the speed, not doing right hand, left hand separately. Change something and make sure that it's continuously getting better. It's not becoming a gamble. By the way, this particular video was a patron request from my Patreon, so if you're interested in requesting a particular video, make sure to check my Patreon where I post multiple times a week, stuff that is not here on my other social media channels. Now, a 4th common practice mistake is having the wrong goals when you're practicing. For example, if your goal when you're approaching a particular passage is don't play the wrong notes, make sure I'm not rushing, try not to mess up on this jump again. The problem is that all those thoughts are essentially negative. It's don't do this, try not to screw up. You may as well be playing and the entire time you're just saying, don't mess up, don't mess up, don't mess up. Trust me, I've been there. It's not a great place to be, especially if you are on stage. Instead, when I'm practicing, I try to think things like, how interesting can I make this passage? Or is there more dynamic contrast that I can make? Can I vary the articulation even more? Is this convincing the way that I'm playing it? And I could be asking a bunch of other different questions, but essentially the goal is always the same thing. It's trying to make the music as compelling as possible. And the 5th common practice mistake is relying too much on muscle memory. Now, the problem with this is that usually you don't realize you're relying too much on muscle memory until it's too late. But that's the number one way that you know you're dealing with a muscle memory issue. And it relates back to the first point when I was talking about people who just practice straight through from start to finish. If you find yourself messing up and you can't jump in in the middle of a phrase and you have to go back and start over, you're probably just going through the motions of muscle memory. So as a way to combat this, if your default is doing that kind of practice, just always starting at the beginning of a phrase, try to start in the middle of a phrase. I'll intentionally do this all the time. When I'm practicing a piece, the way I know how to start practice for the day is I'll just kind of flip through the piece and be like, the other day I was having a problem in this section, and I might start in the middle of a phrase. If that's hard for you to do, then it means you need to definitely do it. Because by the way, if you're practicing in an ensemble situation or with other people, you're gonna have to jump in the middle of a phrase. You can't always have the group accommodate you because you're not able to do that. And if you're getting frustrated trying to do this and it's not working, I find that a lot of times it's an issue of difficulty in the reading of a certain passage. So write in some notes if that helps you. Like if you're starting in the middle of this phrase and you can't figure out what the notes are, just write them down. Like write, that's an F sharp, that's a C, this is this finger, this is that finger. And that way you can jump in at any point. And by practicing this way, it helps solidify your understanding of the piece, and it makes it more likely in the event of a memory slip that you can find your way back. It's much easier to find your way back when you actually have a good understanding of the structure of the piece rather than just relying on muscle memory. And it's not just a safety measure either in the event that you lose your way in a piece. It's also important for interpretation, because when you understand why this chord is used and where you're going and how this phrase leads to that phrase, anybody who's listening can tell that you understand the piece more. And it just makes for a far more interesting piece when you're able to play it with a good understanding of what's happening, because you can relate things to one another rather than just going through from start to finish like a race. Thank you guys so much for your support. I love you guys. Happy practicing, and I will see you guys in the next video.